Imagine boarding a wide-body jet older than most of the people sitting next to you. 41 years of continuous passenger service, one airframe, one airline. The carrier is Iran Air, the flag carrier of a country locked out of the global aviation industry since 1979. Today, Iran Air keeps roughly 150 aircraft flying across the entire Iranian commercial sector, out of a registered fleet closer to 350. It was once promised nearly 200 brand new Boeing and Airbus jets. It received fewer than a dozen, and by the end of this video, you will understand how a national airline stays airborne on improvised parts, shell company purchases, and a phoenix logo that refuses to die. Go back to 1946. The Second World War had just ended. Tehran's skies were almost empty, and two Iranian businessmen saw an opening. Reza Afshar and Gholam Ebtihaj gathered private investors and launched a carrier called Iranian Airways. Surplus American transports were flooding the global market at fire sale prices. Afshar flew to the United States and negotiated directly for 19 Douglas DC-3s. Transworld Airlines provided technical support and took a 10% equity stake in the young company. Within 2 years, flights were lifting off from Tehran for Mashhad, Baghdad, Cairo, Tel Aviv, and eventually Paris. For a country of deserts and mountain ranges the size of Western Europe, aviation was never a luxury. It was survival. A second carrier, Persian Air Services, emerged in the mid-1950s, running freight that later expanded into European passenger routes through a partnership with Belgium's Sabena. For roughly 18 years, the two airlines split the Iranian sky. Then, in the early 1960s, a royal decree merged them into the Iran National Airlines Corporation. A new logo was painted on every tail, Homa, the mythical Persian phoenix believed to bestow kingship on anyone it touched. That bird still flies today. What came next was the golden age. Boeing 707s arrived, then 727s, then 737s, and by the late 70s, Boeing 747 SP wide-bodies. The SP is the short-body, long-range jumbo, and Iran Air used it to chase distances nobody else in the region was chasing. One, non-stop from Tehran to New York, covered 9,867 kilometers in 12 hours and 15 minutes, a world record for scheduled commercial service. By 1978, the flag carrier was flying to 31 international destinations, from Beijing and Tokyo to New York City, with plans on the drawing board for Los Angeles and Sydney. The ambition did not stop there. Iran Air signed for 2 Aerospatiale Concordes supersonic jets from the British Aircraft Corporation with an option on a third. That order made it the final commercial customer in Concorde history. Think about that for a moment. The last airline on the planet to ever order Concorde was not British Airways or Air France. It was Iran Air. The Islamic Revolution changed everything in 1979. Foreign managers left overnight. The Imperial Families Association with the airline became a political liability. International partnerships were severed. Then came the Iran-Iraq War. 8 years of attrition that drained the national treasury. And when the guns finally fell silent in 1988, a quieter war began. Sanctions? Here is the trap. Iran Air's fleet was built on American aluminum, Boeings everywhere. Every bolt, every hydraulic pump, every replacement turbine blade became a political problem the moment United States export law applied. Boeing could not legally supply parts. Airbus, whose jets contained too many American components, often could not either. So what do you do when half your cockpit depends on a factory you are banned from calling? You improvise. Iranian maintenance crews became masters at cannibalizing retired airframes. They sourced parts through shell companies in Dubai, Istanbul, and Kuala Lumpur. They reverse-engineered components in Tehran workshops. They extended service lives far beyond anything Boeing or Airbus ever certified. One Airbus A300 carried Iran Air passengers for 41 years before finally being retired. When it was parked, it was the oldest A300 in commercial passenger service anywhere on Earth. Ingenuity has a cost. Between the early 2000s and the mid-2010s, Iran suffered a painful run of fatal crashes involving aging Western and Russian-built aircraft. Independent analysts linked the incidents at least partially, to spare parts shortages and outdated avionics. Iranian authorities pointed instead to weather, mismanagement, and pilot error. The honest answer lives somewhere between the two narratives, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a story. Passenger numbers fell, fleet age climbed, long-haul routes to Beijing, Tokyo, and most of Europe disappeared. A handful of regional services clung on, often flying jets that Western airlines had retired a generation earlier. Then in 2015, the cage door looked like it might swing open. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was signed in Vienna. 6 world powers agreed to lift broad sanctions in exchange for Iranian nuclear concessions. Iran Air's chief executive at the time, Farhad Parvaresh, began speaking openly about a fleet renewal on a scale no airline in the region had ever attempted. The question was whether any of it would actually arrive. What Iran Air did next was, by any commercial measure, audacious. The airline signed a firm order with Airbus for 100 aircraft split across 3 families, 46 from the Airbus A320 family, 38 from the Airbus A330 family, and 16 Airbus A350 wide-bodies. Then it went to Seattle and signed a separate agreement with Boeing for roughly 80 more airframes. Boeing 737 MAX narrow-bodies, Boeing 777 wide-bodies, and Boeing 777X next-generation jets. When the totals were added up, orders and commitments touched nearly 200 aircraft. One industry analyst was blunt about it. He compared Iran Air to kids walking into a candy store and ordering every flavor on the shelf. There was, by most outside accounts, very little commercial justification for a fleet plan that sprawling. But when you have been starved of new jets for almost 4 decades, restraint is not on the menu. Deliveries began in 2016. Iran Air took its first brand new Airbus A321, then 2 new Airbus A330s, then 8 ATR 72-600 turboprops from the French-Italian joint venture. For a moment, you could walk through Mehrabad International and see a jet that did not smell of 40 years of history. Passengers noticed, crews noticed. Analysts in Europe quietly revised their forecasts upward. Then Washington changed its mind. In May 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the nuclear agreement and reinstated the sanctions regime.
I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
The Treasury Department revoked the licenses that had allowed Boeing and Airbus to sell to Iran. The Boeing order, every airframe of it, was canceled before a single jet was delivered. Airbus halted its remaining deliveries because its aircraft contained too many American parts to justify the legal exposure. Iran Air went from expecting one of the youngest wide-body fleets in the Middle East to receiving almost nothing. So what do you do when the front door slams shut again? You go in through the side. Iran Air and its domestic rivals began quietly buying second-hand aircraft through layered intermediaries. Last year, Iran Air took delivery of 2 used Airbus A330-200s. Both had previously flown with Hong Kong Airlines. Both were manufactured in 2012. They arrived in Tehran in plain white livery and were only later painted in Homa blue and red. Smaller Iranian carriers such as Mahan Air, Iran Air Tour, and Aseman Airlines followed the same playbook, picking up aging Airbus A340s and Airbus A310s through layered ownership structures to keep routes to Kuala Lumpur and Western China alive. Did it work? Partly, but only just barely. Here are the numbers as they stand today. Across the entire Iranian commercial airline sector, roughly 150 aircraft are actually operational. The registered inventory sits closer to 300 or 350. The Iranian Civil Aviation Organization itself estimates the country needs around 550 aircraft to properly serve a population of 90 million people. That is a fleet gap the size of an entire mid-size European aviation sector. Iran Air's own wide-body operation has at times been reduced to a single Airbus A330 in regular scheduled passenger service, usually flying between Tehran and Istanbul. A pair of ATR 72-600 turboprops handle island routes to Kish and Abu Musa in the Persian Gulf. Fokker 100s, aircraft that went out of production in 1997, still operate trunk domestic routes between Tehran and cities such as Shiraz and Isfahan. Think about that. An airline that once ordered Concordes is today keeping Fokker 100s on the line. Now the other side of the ledger. Domestic fares in Iran remain extraordinarily cheap by global standards. Aviation fuel is subsidized at roughly 10 cents per liter, a price that would be unthinkable in Europe or North America. One-way tickets under 50 United States dollars between major Iranian cities are normal. The domestic network is surprisingly dense, connecting holy cities like Mashhad, heritage cities like Isfahan and Shiraz, and Persian Gulf islands that most of the world cannot place on a map. For millions of Iranians in remote provinces, Iran Air is the only reliable way to reach the rest of the country. The same maintenance culture that outside observers criticize for operating geriatric aircraft has also, by necessity, produced some of the most resourceful aviation engineers on the planet. A surprising number of Iranian aerospace graduates now work quietly for carriers in Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and across Southeast Asia. The knowledge base is real, even if the airframes are old. The financial picture is almost impossible to verify from the outside. Iran Air does not publish detailed statements on international wires. It has been cut off from most global distribution systems. Independent analysts believe the airline is sustained mainly through direct government support, subsidized fuel, and bilateral agreements with a shrinking group of friendly nations. Turkey, Russia, China, Iraq, and a handful of Gulf states still take Iranian civilian traffic. Most of the rest of the world does not. This brings us to the inflection point, and it is a sharp one. Both the United States and the European Union have now sanctioned Iran Air directly, accusing the airline of moving Iranian-made drones and drone components to Russia for use in the war in Ukraine. Tehran denies those characterizations. The sanctions remain in place. Around the same period, Iran replaced Iran Air's chief executive, Farzaneh Sharafbafi, the first woman to hold the job and the first Iranian woman with a doctorate in aerospace engineering. Her replacement, Touraj Degani Zanganeh, was a former Air Force commander already listed on a United States Treasury sanctions list from a previous military-linked role. The signal to Western regulators was not subtle. In June 2025, the first round came. Israel launched Operation Rising Lion against Iranian nuclear and military targets.
We struck at the heart of Iran's nuclear enrichment program. We struck at the heart of Iran's nuclear weaponization program.
The United States followed days later with strikes on the Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan nuclear sites, using heavy bombers. Iranian airspace emptied of civilian traffic for weeks. International carriers rerouted around the entire Middle East corridor, and Iran Air was reduced to a trickle of domestic services and a handful of flights to Turkey and a few neighboring states. A fragile ceasefire eventually allowed limited operations to resume. It did not last. On the 28th of February, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a far larger joint campaign against Iran. Multiple waves of strikes hit Iranian military bases, missile production sites, and nuclear infrastructure across the country. Iran responded within hours, firing ballistic missiles and drones at Israel, at United States military bases in the Gulf, and at civilian and military targets across Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. At least 8 states closed their airspace in the opening days of the fighting, including Iran, Israel, Iraq, Jordan, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. Syria closed part of its southern airspace for 12 hours. The European Union Aviation Safety Agency issued a conflict zone information bulletin advising all European operators to avoid the airspace of 11 countries across the region. Lufthansa Group, Air France, KLM, British Airways, Emirates, Fly Dubai, Etihad, Qatar Airways, and dozens of others suspended operations to and over Iran entirely. For Iran Air, the consequences were immediate and total. The Tehran Flight Information Region was closed to all international civilian traffic from the 28th of February. Iran Air suspended every scheduled passenger flight, including domestic services, for 50 days. Mehrabad and Imam Khomeini airports went silent. The handful of regional services that had survived the June 2025 round, mostly to Istanbul, Dubai, Baghdad, and Damascus all stopped. Beirut Rafiq Hariri International Airport was closed when Lebanon was drawn into the conflict in early March. The land borders to Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Turkmenistan became the only practical way out of the country. A conditional ceasefire was declared on the 8th of April 2026, with Pakistan mediating. Implementation has been uneven. Iranian missile launches continued into mid-April, with debris from intercepted ballistic missiles reported as far west as southern Turkey. The United Arab Emirates briefly closed its entire airspace overnight on the 16th and 17th of March as a precautionary measure. A drone strike hit a fuel storage tank at Kuwait International Airport. On the 18th of April, Iran began a phased reopening of the eastern half of the Tehran Flight Information Region for overflights above flight level 285 under recovery procedures. The western half remains closed. On the 21st of April, 2026, Iran's airspace partially reopened to domestic operations. On the 22nd of April, Iran Air operated its first commercial flight in 50 days, the morning service from Tehran to Mashhad. International services have not resumed. Most major foreign carriers have not returned. As of late April 2026, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency Conflict Zone Bulletin remains in force and has been extended through the 1st of May. The financial and operational damage is impossible to estimate from the outside. What is visible is that 50 days of zero revenue, on top of an airline already operating 150 aircraft against a national requirement of 550, on top of compounded sanctions, and the loss of nearly 200 Boeing and Airbus jets that were ordered and never delivered, is the deepest crisis Iran Air has faced since the Iran-Iraq War. Insurance premiums for any carrier still willing to cross the Strait of Hormuz have reached levels not seen since the 1980s tanker war. Fuel costs have climbed across the region, and every Iranian aircraft still flying is now older, more cannibalized, and harder to source parts for than it was 12 months ago. So what happens next? Either diplomacy reopens the door, the sanctions fall, and Iran Air finally receives the modern fleet it was promised a decade ago. Or the cage tightens further, the airspace keeps closing, and Homa's flight path runs out of fuel. In between those extremes sits a third option that looks more likely by the month. A pivot toward Chinese and Russian alternatives. The Comac C-919, the Sukhoi Superjet, aircraft built outside the Western supply chain, potentially available without a treasury license. If the keys to Iran Air landed on your desk tomorrow, would you keep betting on a diplomatic breakthrough and a future Boeing or Airbus delivery? Or would you pivot hard toward Beijing and Moscow and accept that the Western bridge has burned? Tell me in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to explain if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.